What's up, Wizards? It's Dev, Mtg. We like it in Magic. Looks like I'm live. I'm not. It's just you and me for this one. And it's a fun one, too. We're going to be looking at all the best decks from the first week of Phyrexia Standard. Let's go.
And I'm your favorite Magic Channel's favorite Magic Channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck tech.
Backstreet's back. All right, make sure you like and subscribe if you're into it. If not, that's fine. I'm just glad that you're here. Now, we've already had 3 big events that I want to look at in just this first week of Standard. We had the Magic Online Challenge event, which is always a good trial for the beginning of the season. We also had a pretty big Japanese tournament with over 100 entrants. That's pretty fat data right there. But we're going to take it back at the end to MTGO once more to look at the league results. But let's start with the results from that MTGO challenge that I mentioned, because that is the event that the greatest number of people seem to have the most interest in at the beginning of any given season. And we're no different, but there were some availability issues from card lending services on MTGO that may have come into play this time, but there's still plenty of new cards in these results. Now, in first place, you had a Soldier's deck, but there are some new things to analyze here. Don't worry, there's plenty of old stuff. You know, it's a Thalia deck, but nowadays, because of Skrelv, brand new card, your Thalia deck actually gets to not have to run non-creatures. That was a weird sentence, but yeah, you don't have to run stuff like Slip Out the Back or maybe Lauren's Escape anymore, which was arguably the more popular card in a Soldier's deck, so let you keep attacking without losing any damage or tempo or anything. But those cards may have only cost 1 mana, so with a Thalia out, they cost 2. But sometimes that can still step on your toes, you know, you're trying to maximize your mana value in the early game, so sometimes having to pay 2 mana to hold up a Lauren's Escape will keep you from playing a 2-drop, right? So there are issues with that. It can get awkward, and Skrelv effectively lets you run 36 creatures in your Thalia deck now, which is actually really important. Of course, the deck also got Seachrome Coast, which is worth pointing out. This means that you have Adakar Waste, Seachrome Coast, Secluded Courtyard, and Fortified Beachhead. That's 16 lands that produce both colors of mana, which lets you play more Mishra's Foundry. There's 3 in this deck. It's a little bit more comfortable playing a card like this now. So just altogether some good innovations for this deck. Nothing too nuts or nothing that creates a whole new archetype as far as this deck goes, right? But at least some cards that the deck probably, I won't say needed, the deck was probably good enough to begin with, but some decks that definitely make the deck's game plan. Did I say some cards that make the deck's game plan a little bit easier to enact without being so awkward. Now, in second place, a much newer deck than Soldiers, although you could argue that the Boros or perhaps Naya reanimator deck with like Titan of Industry has been around on the lower tiers of the ladder for a while now, lurking for a couple of seasons, but it got Atraxa. So it's instantly a better deck, much, much better. There was some argument among the community about whether or not this or Titan of Industry was a better reanimation target, or if you just played both or what. But as you see, in the entire 75, there's no Titan of Industry. Atraxa is, I think, the better card. I've kind of felt this way the whole time. It's like with Titan, you might blow something up. You might get a 4/4 shield counter or something like that. You might even gain 5 life, who knows. You affected the board state, the game state in a couple of different ways, but it doesn't put cards in your hand so that when they destroy your Titan or they just hit farewell or whatever, you have no way of rebuilding at that point. But Atraxa, if she doesn't get killed, can just, lead to a 14-point life swing every turn. So she must be answered. If she's not, she usually ends the game. But if she is answered, she still put like 4 cards in your hand, and there's not a single bad card in the entire deck. So I really like this thing. The only other new card in here, in the entire 75, to my understanding, yes, is Nahiri the Unforgiving. I hate that they made it the Phyrexian version because you can't read it. That's super silly, weird oversight by Magic, Magic Online or Magic.com, Wizards, whatever. But yeah, this will also reanimate stuff from time to time. It also draws and discards cards, so it rummages or whatever, allowing you to dump Atraxas and Wardens into your yard, whatever. So it's a sweet little deck. There probably will be, we see Unlicensed Hearse in the sideboard here, and you see it in a lot of sideboards, and this deck is a big reason for that, Things like Graveyard Trespasser and Farewell and other cards might mess with this strategy, but even if you can't pull stuff out of the yard, you still have things like Big Score and Fable the Mirror Breaker to ramp you into stuff like Portal and Atraxa. So, not all is lost if you come off of your reanimation game plan. The game goes long enough, you're probably just going to land some of these from your hand. So deck is neat. In a kind of mid-rangey format, this goes way over the top and also has like ridiculous turn 4 plays too. So it's in a neat position even with Graveyard Hate in the format because Atraxa is such a powerful target. You know, if you are able to reanimate, it doesn't matter if they have the removal. You got a whole new game plan. In third place is a Grixis deck. Interesting only because it doesn't play a single new card, not even the lands. It doesn't play Darkslick Shores. It doesn't play Blackcleave Cliffs, the black-red and blue-black fast lands from Phyrexia. It doesn't play them at all. And it's playing Invoke Despair, you know? I think this is one of those card availability issues things. I don't think that this player was trying to make a point. I think they just wanted to participate in the challenge, didn't have any new cards, registered this deck, and got third place because Grixis is still very likely the best or one of the top 3 decks in best of 3, no matter what. Now in fourth place, Esper Friends, which arguably plays more new cards than any other deck in this whole thing. It even plays Sheoldred's Edict. It's not just a bunch of new Planeswalkers. It plays Sheoldred's Edict, apparently because they thought, well, I'm playing 16 Planeswalkers. Maybe everybody else is playing Planeswalkers. But this is still a pretty good card. I find that I've been playing a sort of Kaya Control Orzhov deck lately with a million removal spells. And Sheoldred's Edict is a good card in that deck and a great card against it because it can actually get a Kaya off the table along with Invoke Despair. Those are cards that are really good against Kaya, but this deck plays Kaya. Just the one copy because, you know, once she's out, it's really hard to answer her. She's win you the game. But we've also got 3 Vraska for drawing cards, proliferating all of our Planeswalkers. Obviously, this should be at least a 3 of. In the deck, Eternal Wanderer, so pretty top heavy, right? A few 6 or 5 mana Planeswalkers with Vraska. 7 mana with Kaya, 2 6 manas with Eternal Wanderer, right? But it's a good deck, you know. Jace is in here, the Perfected Mind. This can enable mill win cons, but also just draw you cards some of the time. And then there's even a copy of Kaito Dancing Shadow, the 4 mana Kaito. The deck even plays Drown in Icor. It actually does that. It's a sorcery speed removal spell that doesn't kill Shelly, but it kills most things in the early game, and that's what you care about. And if you do happen to have Planeswalkers when you play it, because it still kills, bye Ziggy, it still kills like the majority of creatures in Standard, like 90-something%. In fifth place, we got a mono red gamer trying to make it happen. There's not a single new card in the main deck, but there is Rebel Salvo, a 3 of, in the sideboard here. This is, I assume, for Sheoldreds and stuff, but it also could be for Dominuses that have indestructible counters on them and whatever. And there's a few other things. I mean, I guess there's Guardian of New Benalia can have indestructible. I mean, there's things that you could target this with, or target, with this. And for the most part, I don't think it's really it doesn't care about your affinity for equipment. There's no equipment in the deck, but still, it's a thing in the board that kills Shelly, and that's what matters. It was Rending Flame, but now this is easily the best thing in the format that can kill her. In sixth, we have another 5-color pile, but this one, not really Reanimator. I've got it labeled as 5-color Reanimator, but it's not. This is just a 5-color sort of domain-ish mid-range deck that plays Leyline Binding, along with a single copy of the Kami War, and then 4 copies of Atraxa and 28 lands. There's some sweepers, Burn Down the House, Farewell, Depopulate. Blue Sun's Twilight is in the main deck. This is a weird deck. It's kind of a weird one. It's basically the Atraxa deck with, Fable of the Mirror Breaker and stuff, but it goes a different route. Rather than reanimating, it's going to go domain, just string the game out as long as possible, and then eventually draw 1 million cards off of Atraxa, maybe land an Eternal Wanderer and win that way. So Blue Sun's Twilight, still your Shelly. There's definitely ways. This is one of the weirder decks that we'll be looking at pretty much all day, and I'm not sure that it's the best way to go, but Go Burn over here got 6th place with it in the first event of the season, so it definitely does some weird things and approaches from weird angles, but it's very much a best of 3 deck. I think if you take this into best of 1, you're going to be in a little bit of trouble, even with 5 sweepers in the deck and 3 strangles. But I will say, in best of 3, this looks like it approaches the format from some cool angles. But in 7th place, Vampiric Frog with the best username of the entire event. This is another Grixis one, but this one actually plays the new lands, 2 Blackleaf Cliffs, 1 Darkslick Shores. I don't know if that's all they could get, or if that's actually the number they think you should play. I'm not sure. But this list is a little bit different. It's the one that plays Wandering Mind. So there's that. So the list is a little bit different, but the addition of the new lands did not really help them that much. They came in 7th place, maybe. Not everyone has a good day. Maybe but they still had a good enough day to make the top 8, so there's that. I'll move on to username Ramp, who is not playing Ramp. They're actually playing an honest-to-God Atraxa Reanimator deck. I mean, We've seen one that's Reanimator, one that isn't, and now this one that is basically very close to the same exact list as the list that got second place, but we're playing 4 Restoration of Iganjo in this one, going all the way, right? So this one is even more all in and didn't do quite as well, but still managed to put 2.5, Atraxa Reanimator decks, really, 2 Reanimator decks and an Atraxa deck into the top 8 of the first big event of the season, which is super noteworthy. Now, I'm not going to linger around in the top 16 for too long, but there are some things I want to point out while we're here. Like all of the mono white decks, there's like 4 mono white decks in the top 16, but none in the top 8. You'll see why I don't think that necessarily means mono white is bad in just a moment when we get to the next tournament that we'll talk about. But still, this is the first mono white deck of the event. It got 10th place, and it does actually play 3 copies of the Eternal Wanderer. This one took out Sanctuary Warden completely from the list. I had said a few times during previous season, maybe they duck a couple of copies of that card or 1 copy and play some Eternal Wanderer. This user just took all the copies of Warden out, and they're putting in Wanderer instead. It is an interesting cut, and I do think Wanderer is probably the better card, all things considered. But it's interesting to see just no Warden whatsoever. Aside from that, though, Ossification is also in this deck. This is a very interesting pick to me, much more interesting than the Eternal Wanderer, even though the Eternal Wanderer is obviously the more powerful card. It ends games and stuff, and it's probably the best new addition to the deck in terms of actually finishing and locking the game down. However, Ossification is an interesting pick because it's a bit of a non-bow with Farewell, which is still in the main deck. I did not think that Ossification and Farewell would show up in the same deck. I figured this was a choice that you make, but this person came in 10th place. And for that matter, Mono White also got 11th and 12th. But a deck that didn't make top 16 that I nonetheless want to point out is Venom 1's 28th place effort here, still in the top 32 for what that's worth. But still, this is a cool little deck, and the reason that I'm pointing it out is because from first all the way down to this slot, number 28, that's how far you have to go to get to a new deck that I haven't talked about yet. Such a weird looking deck to me, but I love it too, It doesn't play Sheoldred. This is a Golgari deck that plays a 4-drop in black that costs you 2 black mana, so it has no excuse not to play Sheoldred, but instead it plays Enrica Donati in that Sheoldred slot, which I think is so interesting. But then new cards like Glissa Sunslayer, it's got Glissy Elliott, and then the new Mana Dork, the 2-mana Armored Scrap Gorger that taps for any colored mana, gets oil counters, and eats cards in yards. This is really important, I assume, against Atraxa decks, but here they are in 28th place against a field full of Atraxa decks. So again, what do I know? But you get to play Terra Sunder in this deck, which has proven to be a great card in me testing Golgari. Nissa, Ascended Animist, Vraska. So you get these creatures, right? You get Tenacious Underdog, Nimata, Gix, Glissa, Scrap Gorger, all these decent creatures. And then you get to kind of play a Super Friends top end with 10 different planeswalkers. So it's it kind of reminds me of The Rock from back in the day, one of the first true famous mid-range decks. And this is really giving me those vibes. I've been playing a deck a little bit like this on the ladder from time to time. I play Invoke Despair and Sheoldred, so it's not quite the same deck, but very reminiscent with some very spicy picks like Enrica. So I really wanted to show this deck to you. So that was the standard challenge for the first week of the season, but now let's move to a very different tournament with very different results. This is a 105-person Japanese tournament hosted by, I believe, Albani Chica, but I probably got the pronunciation wrong and I apologize. But this was called Melee, if I'm not mistaken. And 105 interest is pretty good, especially for the very beginning of a season. That's a lot. So if you can tell the the words on your screen right now, again, very different results. The mono white mid-range decks were not relegated to the bottom half of the top 16 this time around. First and second place were both the mono white mid-range decks. Now this first one is kind of neat to look at because it does have some new cards, right? It's got all 4 copies of Ossification in the main deck and did not play any copies of Farewell in the main deck. So it was one of the strike one point for that. It also plays 2 copies of Sanctuary Warden, where the decks in the challenge largely didn't. So again, 1 point in favor. I think we're back to neutral at this point for playing Warden and not playing Farewell in a deck with Ossification in it. Ossification is the only new card in the main deck, but it does play Eternal Wanderer, this time in the sideboard. Now the second place mono white mid-range deck by Yushi Izuki, this does play Eternal Wanderer in the main deck. It does play Ossification in the main deck, but does not play Farewell. All of the decks have played Ossification. That's the only new card that they all definitely play in the main deck no matter what. So Ossification wins, and I guess Fateful Absence loses. Now, in third place at this event, yet another third place with no new cards in it. Like, not completely no new cards, because the deck does play 2 Sheldred's Edict in the sideboard, so I guess there's that. You know, you've got some Dark Slick Shores, Seachrome Coast, you know, like there's some stuff going on in this deck. There's some new things, but in the main deck, there's really nothing of note that's new. It's just the Esper mid-range deck. Well, I guess it does have Vraska. I spoke too soon. It does have a single copy of Vraska to proliferate your planeswalkers and draw cards and remove creatures. This is just a good card, but they only found room for 1 copy. Meanwhile, this deck does look kind of dangerous to me. Very often, the Esper mid-range decks will choose between whether or not they want to be a Legends deck with like Thalia and a bunch of Legends and almost no like non-creature cards. Or they'll be a Planeswalkers deck, you know, like the deck we saw in the MTGO challenge that's like 16 Planeswalkers. This deck is both. This deck can play, you know, Dinnick on 2 or Rafine Scheming Seer or Wedding Announcement on 3. It can do those things like your, you know, Esper mid-range decks. And then it kind of like switches modes into the Planeswalker half of the deck, and I think that is in a way dangerous. I mean, Rafine is something that is prioritized. Your opponent has to remove it or it's just going to draw you cards. And it's also good at protecting planeswalkers if it has to stay back and not swing, but it cannot swing and other stuff can attack and still get the bonus from Rafine. So it's just a good 3-drop. Wedding Announcement is also good for protecting your planeswalkers, obviously. So just a sweet little all-around list here. Now in 4th place, we got Grixis with no new cards that I know of, as far as I can tell, but it is still kind of an interesting deck. I'm not going to sit on it for too long. It does play a Sheldred's Edict, I guess, in the main deck, a single Sheldred's Edict in the sideboard, rather, but aside from that, I guess Dark Slick Shores. I mean, again, Black Cleave Cliffs, it does play the lands, but the main deck is not your normal Grixis deck. I'm not going to spend too long on this because you know Grixis, but the reason I'm going to spend any time on this is that you know Grixis, and it's not quite the Grixis deck, right? It's got Ether Channeler in here as the 3-drop. Kind of a pick. That's a pick, you know. It's a good card to copy with Fable, so I guess there's that. The deck also plays Galvanic Iteration, a card we haven't seen in Grixis in a minute, so this player is up to some things. They want to copy their Invoke Despair. They're living the dream. In 5th place is our friend from the last tournament that made 28th, right? This is Golgari Midrange. It's very similar in terms of structure, but this one is doing the Mimi Phyrexian Obliterator into Bushwhack thing. So, but Bushwhack is a neat card. You know, people think that it's just a meme with Obliterator, but this can help you get the black sources you need to cast the Obliterator in the first place, which is cool. And then sometimes it's just a removal spell. You know, my 4/4 Graveyard Trespasser, because it's nighttime, takes out your 3/3 guy or whatever. So, like, Bushwhack just isn't terrible. But this is the deck that you've seen every now and again. It's got Phyrexian Obliterator, Bushwhack, Invoke Despair, right? But it's also got Glissa. That's neat. It does take out Sheldred completely to play the Phyrexian Obliterator, but I think that's fine. But for the most part, this is mono black that adds Glissa. That's about it. There's also Mardu midrange, Bant tempo, which we'll look at, you know, Mardu midrange. Not really much to write home about. This is the Angels deck, which actually hung on a good bit. We'll see it too in the MTGO League results. The Angels deck is still around. You see it from time to time. If you didn't know the Angels deck was a thing, the Angels deck is a thing. It's actually a real deck. You just like copy Angels with Fable of the Mirror Breaker, and it tends to be a pretty good plan. But Bant tempo is the next deck to look at here. This is the it's almost the Poison Ivy deck. It doesn't actually play Ivy, but it plays Skrelv, Venerated Rot Priest, Jawbone Duelist, ladies and gentlemen, the double strike toxic one guy, and then 3, not 4, but 3 Blood Contaminator along with Homestead Courage, Experimental Augury in the deck to proliferate and get the cards that you need, Serum Snare to proliferate and, you know, removal and stuff, return a thing to your hand, March, slip out the back, Tyvar's Stand, March of Burgeoning Life is a 1-up. So you know this deck. You know this deck. It's just what they did was they took out Ivy from the Poison Ivy deck, and they just slammed together the Poison Ivy decks and green-white toxic decks, and this is kind of the result. I kind of like 3 Bloated Contaminator here to keep the curve as low as possible, right? is basically what this is. And Jawbone Duelist is kind of your Illuminator Virtuoso in this deck, like a little bit. It's just a lot of neat stuff you can do with this, you know. If you have a Venerated Raw Priest out and you like protect your duelist, or just cast Homestead Courage on your duelists, you know, they get extra poison and then they get even more poison. They don't want to block your 3/2/2 duelists. So I don't know, man. There's something to it. Obviously the deck made the top 8, so there is something to it. And I think that this is kind of an already like a very soon, you know, it happens so fast, evolution on the Poison Ivy deck. What's the best way to play Poison Ivy? Don't play Ivy at all. But let's round a probably pretty long video out here with the standard league results. Now, there's not a whole lot of really noteworthy stuff. You see here a 5-0 mono white, and it's just the mono white deck. There's a lot of that. But there are a few decks in the league that I specifically want to look at. Now, the first 5-0 that I want to look at is actually a deck that we've already seen. This is Venom 1 again with a 5-0 with this green-black deck that plays on Rika Domnathi. It's literally the exact same deck, the exact same user that we saw from the challenge. But I just want to point out that 28th place in the challenge, but also a 5-0. Now, the reason that we're looking at league results last is that these are the least reliable, you know. Almost any deck can get a 5-0 on a good day where there's mana problems for the opponent or no mana problems for you, or you just draw the best curve or the best answers to what they have, and it just works out that way 5 games in a row. It's somewhat more luck-based than some other ways to gather data. Let me just point that out about leagues. 5-0 is not the most reliable measure of whether a deck is good or not, but top 32 of a big tournament, perfect 5-0 in the league. This deck is at least worth looking at, is all I'm saying. But the other deck from league results that I want to look at that even more illustrates the fact that any deck can go 5-0, but don't let that make you think that I'm like pooping on this deck. I think this is an interesting deck, is Blue-Black Poison. This is actually the first deck we played this season. We played this in early access. Vraska was usually a game ender, but she's in the sideboard here. We're mostly focusing on instant speed in the main deck, I've noticed. The deck doesn't have a whole lot of stuff that's sorcery speed aside from these creatures, you know, Arcane Proxy, so it can recast again. It needs the gas. It needs a thing like Vraska so it can get gassed and gas and recast those important, you know, proliferate spells in the late game. And Arcane Proxy helps it do that while also having, you know, getting a blocker and stuff. That's important. Bilious Skull Dweller, great blocker, but sometimes your opponent just lets it through. This is usually worth like 2 poison a game. It's a great first thing to play in a game of cards too. I really like this. I'm not surprised to see it show up. I'm really not. And then Voidwing Hybrid, of course. This is the best creature for the deck, except for maybe Proxy, like oddly enough, but obviously Voidwing needs to be in here. The only things that proliferate were really Experimental Augury, and Drown and Ichor proliferates. And then Prologue to Phyresis gives them a poison counter. But, you know, you got Bilious Skull Dweller and Voidwing Hybrid to give them poison counters, but there's really only 12 ways to give them poison counters in the main deck. So, I don't know. It's an interesting build of the deck that really doesn't go all in on poison and instead plays these counter spells and removal spells and stuff that I didn't know if the deck really had room to play, but obviously it does. So, 5-0, it doesn't mean you're going to go 5-0 with this deck or anything, but it does prove the deck has some amount of legs. Just a tiny bit, and it's kind of cool to see. But let me go back to my desktop background, which does not blind you. I'm sorry, everybody. But altogether, the takeaways from this are that, you know, the more things change, the more they stay the same. We still see mono white just better. It got a few new cards, so it's a little bit better in this environment. It was already a good deck. I think it moved possibly from the B tier and finally took its seat among, you know, the big boy decks and standard in the A tier. Aside from that, though, there's, you know, Esper Friends was a new deck, Atraxa, Reanimator, and 5-color Atraxa with like Domain. Those are new decks. Poison is a new deck. Golgari is a new deck, but you could also argue that aside from Atraxa, none of those new decks really got a whole lot of traction, except for Atraxa. Got a lot of attraction. When it really shakes out, you've got Soldiers, Mono Red, which had 1 showing, but it's still a big deck in best of 1. Grixis is still here. Mono White, 5-color Reanimator, Esper Legends / Friends, but it looks like Esper Friends is the more of a deck now. Mono Blue is still lurking out there. Golgari, Poison, the Jund decks, the Angels decks. I mean, altogether, even if 2 of those decks aren't real, let's say the Golgari decks aren't real and the Poison decks aren't real, if all the other ones are at least on a tier list somewhere of standard decks, that's 10 different decks. Even if you cut out the decks like Jund, for instance, that might be flash in the pan, people are trying them out for the first couple of weeks of the season. If you cut out Angels, even though it showed up in every single thing we looked at, including the league results, we just didn't stop on it. Angels showed up in all 3 tournaments, but if you don't even count Angels, there's still like 8 decks in this format, and Mono Black didn't pop up at all. But again, that's more of a best of 1 deck like Mono Red, so I wouldn't expect it to pop up so much in best of 3. But all that said, there's 6 real decks. There's like 3 or 4 A tier decks. The rest of those decks, those 6 or 8 decks, are filled out by B tier decks, and then there's even 2 to 4 C tier decks in standard that are worth playing. And this is only the first week. But things are looking a little healthy. Now, I will say I don't like playing against the majority of these decks. I don't like playing against Grixis because I played against it so much. Soldiers, I don't love playing against. Mono Red, I don't love playing against, but that's a me thing. These are decks that we've all played against a lot in the last few months, and I think we're all kind of burnt out on some of the big players in standard. But you can't say that there's a lack of deck diversity at the moment. I think there's plenty of deck diversity. We just don't like playing against any of them. But that's honestly more or less it. I was hoping this would be a short, succinct kind of report on the first week of the format, but that didn't happen. I don't know why I thought I could pull that off, but there's a lot. That just means there's a lot to talk about in the early days of the season. Even though it doesn't look like much has changed, the innovations we have gotten are important to bring up. So just let me know how you feel about everything down there. What decks you've been having success with, especially anything that I didn't list here. I think we'll all be interested in. So let me know down there how you feel about the whole kit and caboodle. And I will catch you cats later. Very soon, as a matter of fact. We got a lot of content coming. It's stream tomorrow and all that. So I will see you sooner rather than later. I am Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.